There's a green light, which is promising.
Yes! Welcome to Casual Politics, Lord Powell. Thank you very much for accepting my request, and I'm very grateful to you. I know that you need no introduction. Everyone they know you. You've been private secretary to Lady Thatcher from 1983 to 1990, and then only for a year you were private secretary to John Major following your departure from the cabinet office. So my first question is, when is your finest hour in Downing Street?
Well, you know, there were many rather fine hours in Downing Street, some on domestic politics, some on foreign policy. I think the best of all was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. After all, for people of my generation, we've been brought up with the Cold War. It was part of our lives, and frankly, we didn't expect to see the end of it. But when suddenly those historic events came together in 1989, freedom spreading across Eastern Europe, and then the fall of the hated Berlin Wall, leading on to the big conference in Paris, which really marked the end of the Cold War. That was beyond our wildest dreams, and it was, I think, the finest moment that I experienced in Downing Street, not least because Margaret Thatcher had made such an enormous contribution to that very happy result.
And how would you classify the role that British they played to end the Cold War?
Oh, I think we had a very substantial role in ending the Cold War, for two reasons at least. One is, throughout the period of the Cold War, we were the closest partner to the United States. We had the biggest and most effective defense forces alongside those of the United States. So we were their most solid ally in making sure the West was effectively defended through NATO, preventing Soviet encroachment on Europe. So as number one allies, I would say, that was our first contribution. Our second was Margaret Thatcher's skill, first of all, in finding, identifying, and then forging a relationship with President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. Because through their dialogue, I think she encouraged him to make the changes in the Soviet Union, which led on to the end of the Cold War. His softer version of communism, his willingness not to interfere when the people of Eastern Europe wanted to have their freedom. You see, earlier generations of Soviet leaders would have intervened, as they did in Hungary in 1956 and in Prague in 1968, to suppress rebellions with military force and killing hundreds of people. Mr. Gorbachev was not like that. He was a humane man. So I think her dialogue, Margaret Thatcher's dialogue with Mr. Gorbachev, was very important in changing the climate in which Cold War issues were addressed and finally resolved. So she deserves great credit for that too.
And you talk about Mikhail Gorbachev, and last week he said that we're about to start a new Cold War. Do you agree with him?
You know, for once I didn't agree with Mikhail Gorbachev when he said that. Whether he said it of his own free will or because he is under enormous pressure in Russia to follow the line taken by President Putin, I don't know. President Gorbachev is an old man now, he's very plainly in poor health. Yes, there is a risk. Obviously, there must be a risk of a Cold War, and it's not in our gift whether there is one. I mean, President Putin is behaving a little bit in the old Cold War style. He intervenes in various countries around the perimeter of Russia. He's intervened in Georgia, and taken part of their territory in Abkhazia. He's intervened in Moldova. He's clearly now in Ukraine. He's seized the Crimea. He's got Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. And people speculate as to what his next objectives might be. Would it be once more to intervene in the Baltic republics of Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia? Or maybe it's the old Serbian republic. So it's really in his gift. Personally, I don't think he can, even if he wants to, bring us to a new Cold War. I don't think Russia any longer has the means to do so. I think sanctions against Russia will erode its economic strength, and it will be, frankly, suicidal on his part to attempt to do that. I think what President Putin really wants is for Russia to be taken seriously as a world power, to see the Russian economy grow, provide prosperity, and to become an accepted partner of the West. But he feels very keenly the humiliation of what happened to the old Soviet Union. It disintegrated after the Cold War. Russia itself came on hard times. And it's this constant battle in him between wanting to be accepted and determined to show that Russia is still a powerful force in the world. In a way, you see that there's a great contradiction in his policies. At one moment this year, he was spending billions of pounds on the Winter Olympics to showcase Russia, what a wonderful modern society it was, an accepted part of the world community. A few weeks later, he's invading another country in the old Cold War style. I mean, you can't have it both ways, and he needs to choose.
And coming back to your time as Lady Thatcher's private secretary, in what way did you find your role challenging?
Well, I think in our system of government, where the Prime Minister's office is very small, it's nothing like as big as the White House or the Bundeskanzleramt in Germany or the Élysée Palace in Paris. It's a very small office. And a Prime Minister is not supported by thousands of civil servants like our Minister of Defence or our Minister of Health, but only by a handful of people. You have very great responsibility. Even though, let us say, in protocol terms, you're nobody, or an anonymous person, you're just a private secretary. Obviously, at the very heart of government, working for a Prime Minister, you have to accept a degree of responsibility that goes beyond your rank. And you have to do it with a great sense of personal responsibility too. Nobody elected me or any other private secretary to do this role. We were appointed to do it, and our role is to support the Prime Minister. But even the most active Prime Minister, as Margaret Thatcher was, can't do everything. And she needs support and needed help and support in that way. So it is a very, very responsible job. And for a Prime Minister who worked as hard as Margaret Thatcher did, and for as many hours every day, it meant that we all had to work very hard too. Weekends, 18-hour days, you name it. And I stayed much longer than most people do, and really went through nine years or so of this. And yes, it was very wearing, it was tough on my family, but although I'm not a politician, I never joined a political party, I did believe in what she was doing for the country. Not in a political sense, but simply I believed that Britain needed to be revived after 1979. We had reached a very low point in our nation's history. And I believed that we wanted to count again in the world. And she made both those things happen. She rebuilt Britain, she restored our self-confidence, and she made us count again in the world. And that was it was a very invigorating to be along for the ride, as I say. The adrenaline flowed, and despite the harsh and heavy terms, as it were, of working at that pace for so long, the rewards in terms of what happened to Britain were well worthwhile. I wouldn't have missed one moment of it.
And when she appointed you as her private secretary, did you ask for some advice from those who had many experiences in this field? For example, Lord Robert Armstrong, who was a private secretary to 2 prime ministers.
No, I didn't seek any specific advice in that sense. I do remember that before being interviewed by her, and I had actually met her before, so I wasn't a complete stranger to her, before our formal interview, another friend who was working in Downing Street at the time, Lord Butler, said to me, these interviews are very difficult. She talks all the time, and at the end she says, oh, he won't do, because he never said anything. So I thought, well, I better get in there and start talking. So I was hardly through the door when I was busy shooting my mouth off. And at the end of the interview, she apparently said, oh, I'm not sure he'll do, he never stops talking. But she hired me all the same, and so it must have come out right. But the role of a private secretary is very well understood in the British civil service tradition. So you don't really need to be told much about it. You know what your duties and responsibilities are. Above all, to keep out of the politics. You're not there as a politician, you're there as a civil servant working for the country as a whole. And as long as you observe that rule, you're safe.
Is it true that first you were supposed to become Geoffrey Howe's private secretary when he was the Foreign Secretary, and then?
Well, I read in Geoffrey Howe's memoirs.
Yes.
That he was a candidate to be his private secretary.
Yeah.
If so, I was totally unaware of it. So it's a surprise to me, but maybe someone in the Foreign Office had that idea. The Foreign Office, of course, became increasingly less keen on me as I stayed longer and longer with Margaret Thatcher, because they thought I was usurping too much influence from the Foreign Office. So they were never very happy with my stay there, and that was one of the reasons that really led me at the end of all those years to decide to leave the Foreign Office, leave the civil service, and start a completely different career in business.
And why, when we talk about the relationship that Lady Thatcher had with President Reagan, why we talk about the special relationship, but we don't, when we talk about her relationship with President Carter, we don't talk about the special relationship. Why is that?
Well, it wasn't very special in President Carter's time, but to give you a fuller answer, the special relationship really dates from the Second World War, when we were the two principal allies fighting Hitler, and our militaries and our intelligence were particularly close. So our relationship really was special. And that continued after the Second World War with the nuclear relationship. We were the next country after America to acquire nuclear weapons. That game set us apart, let us say, from other countries for quite a while. But it was more than that. We were English-speaking countries, we were both democratic countries, we were both free market countries. And that made us natural partners for many, many years. And it took us through President Eisenhower, or first of all, across President Truman, President Eisenhower, even under President Nixon. It wasn't so special by the time we got to President Carter. He had rather different views of society and indeed of foreign policy than Margaret Thatcher did. But it came back into full vigour, the special relationship, under President Reagan. And that was partly because Margaret Thatcher and President Reagan had known each other in opposition, and neither of them was holding government office, and discovered very quickly that they had very similar ideas on the really big issues of the day. They believed that communism was evil, and they believed it was not enough to have so-called détente, which meant living with communism. They thought communism needed to be defeated, and the free market democratic society should replace it. So, and they believed in a low-tax economy, they believed in the trade unions not having too much power. So they were natural ideological partners, quite apart from the previous special relationship between Britain and the United States as military, intelligence and political allies. If you add the two together, it made a very powerful relationship. That continued for a while under President Bush Sr. He was brought up in the same traditions. The personal relationship was not quite so close under President Bush Sr. And he took the view that after the exceptionally close relationship between Margaret Thatcher and President Reagan, America's relations with Europe needed some rebalancing, and that the United States should come closer to France and Germany. And at the beginning, I was a bit worried about that. I thought we were going to lose out. And I remember saying to Margaret Thatcher, what ought we to be doing to retain our position as America's most privileged partner? And she said, Charles, don't worry. They'll soon remember who their real allies are. And of course, along came the first Gulf War, when we had to expel Saddam Hussein from Crusade. But who were the Americans' principal allies? Who sent the largest forces to stand alongside them? It was us. So the relationship remained strong. And I think even under President Clinton, you would still call it a special relationship. I think the change came really now with President Obama. President Obama's whole culture, history and background is quite different. He basically tends to look more towards the Pacific than towards Europe. He doesn't identify particularly with Britain. I think there's a perfectly good relationship with the United States and Britain, but it's not that special. And anyway, I think the modern generation of British politicians don't like to talk so much about a special relationship. They feel very sensitive to the charge that if you have a special relationship, then in a sense you are America's poodle. You know, they call the shots, you just obey. And it's better to be more independent. Actually, I think the substance is unchanged, but they're just sensitive about using the term special relationship, so we don't talk about it these days. Whether that will be true in the future, I don't know. I can think of some future American possible presidents who would want to have a special relationship with the UK, but maybe not all of them. Times change.
As you perfectly said, the time changed. And but in the mid-80s, when Nelson Mandela came to this country, first Lady Thatcher regarded him as a terrorist, and then she didn't want to receive him in Downing Street. So to what extent did you agree with her?
Well, I'm afraid you've got your history completely wrong. In the mid-1980s, Nelson Mandela was a prisoner still and was quite unable to come to any country because he couldn't travel. He only actually came here in 1990 when he was released. Margaret Thatcher never refused to meet him. Indeed, she issued him a warm invitation, and she was one of the first people he visited when he came to London. And he came to number 10 Downing Street. I was present there for the meeting, of course. He had lunch with Margaret Thatcher and a very long discussion. So, I mean, let's get the facts right.
Yeah.
Going back into an earlier part of the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher was asked whether the ANC, of which he was president, even though he was in prison, was a terrorist organisation. And she said yes, she did regard it as a terrorist organisation because it adopted terrorist tactics. Now, some people would say, well, but freedom fighters can't be terrorists because they're fighting for something very valuable. But you can't deny, if they use terrorist tactics, like blowing up innocent civilians, that they are acting as terrorists. Just in the same way as people in Ireland would not accept the IRA as terrorists, yet they were blowing up innocent civilians. So you have to understand that calling the ANC a terrorist organisation was a literal truth. Now, it may not have been a very political thing to say, it may not have made her many friends in Africa, or amongst other countries to say so, but Margaret Thatcher always spoke her mind. She didn't believe in pussyfooting around and being diplomatic, and that's the way she did it. But Nelson Mandela, she fought very hard for Mandela's release from prison, and in my view, she had more influence on the white South African government in persuading them that they really had to release Nelson Mandela than any other outside politician had. Much more influence.
But the difference was that because you compared IRA to his terrorist group, and then Nelson Mandela, he became a hero, but Mr. McGuinness, he didn't become a hero.
No, that's quite right. And Mandela deserves to be a hero because he espoused the cause of peaceful change and was absolutely against terrorism. But in the earlier times, I think the point she was making was that the ANC, his party, was practicing terrorism. We all know they were provoked, we all know they were very badly treated by the white supremacist government, but that doesn't excuse the fact that it was terrorism. You can't deny terrorism is terrorism, even if it's practiced in a good cause.
And now let's go to Westland's affair that happened in 1986. And everyone's in the cabinet they said that she handled the affair very badly because she was misbriefed. So my question is, was she misbriefed? Was it a failure from her private secretaries and special advisors, or from the Foreign Office that she was misbriefed?
Well, first of all, Margaret Thatcher was certainly not misbriefed about Westland, nothing like that at all. And it was nothing whatsoever to do with the Foreign Office, who were not involved. It was very much a domestic policy question. It was the Department of Trade and Industry, the main government department involved. No, I can tell you exactly what the Westland affair was. It was a power struggle. It was a power struggle between Margaret Thatcher, who believed in the free market, who believed that companies should make their own decisions, including what partners they wanted to have. If they wanted an American partner or a European partner, they should decide. And Michael Heseltine, who believed that the government's role was to intervene in business, to intervene in industry, and tell it what it should decide, a sort of statist line. And they were so directly opposed on this, one of them had to win, and it had to be Margaret Thatcher. If she had lost the argument on Westland, she would have lost her position as Prime Minister. So it was an old-fashioned political arm wrestling in which one of the two had to win, and she won. She wasn't misbriefed at all. She didn't need to be misbriefed. There were all sorts of allegations made about who leaked what document and so on, but that was irrelevant. That was small stuff. That didn't really matter. What mattered was a struggle for power between two very important, powerful politicians, and she had to win it.
Well, before going to debate in the Commons, she said to one of her advisors or private secretaries, she said, I may not be the Prime Minister in the next few hours. But what happened that she regained her confidence after the debate?
I'm never sure she actually said that.
Yeah.
I've said it written somewhere. I have no recollection of her saying it, and I was with her every hour of the day really through that time. I can tell you what restored her confidence.
His memoir.
Well, probably it sounds like him. What restored her confidence was the absolutely pathetic performance of the opposition leader Neil Kinnock in the debate. And so, of course, she got off the hook quite easily. There were some difficult questions to answer because the legal advice tendered by the law officers is supposed to be confidential, and it became public knowledge. It was leaked to the press. It wasn't leaked to the press by number 10 Downing Street. But nonetheless, that was a difficult issue for any Prime Minister. But it wasn't unusual as an issue of that scale. I mean, you can see today all issues that government have of a not really serious nature. The other day there was this question of should there be a debate on the a vote in Parliament on the European arrest warrant, and the government managed to wrap it up in something else. So there was a minor political row. Westland would have been a minor political row had it not also been a struggle to death between two powerful politicians.
And would you agree with me that except 1979, Lady Thatcher, she won the other elections because of only on foreign affairs. In 1983 on Falklands War, and then in 1987, she was all over the papers, on TV, meeting world leaders. And so was it more, she won on foreign affairs than domestic affairs?
Well, I wish I could say I thought that, having myself worked a lot on foreign affairs,
Yeah.
and I think they certainly contributed very much to her standing in the country. But fundamentally, no. I think she won the election because people knew she was prepared to take the tough decisions necessary to rebuild this country's economy, to bring down the tax rates, to get the trade unions back in their proper role of looking after their members' interests instead of trying to bring down the truly elected government. That she was prepared to privatise, nationalise industries. She was prepared to make it possible for people to buy council houses and own their own homes. That's why they voted for her in the end. People, I think, don't vote on foreign affairs very much. It helps the overall image. It shows you as a respected international figure, a commanding personality. But at the end of the day, it's the hard substance which wins the elections.
And some people, they regard your time, your time in Downing Street. They say that you were becoming more one of her special advisors than her civil servant. So do you agree with?
No, of course I do. No, it was ridiculous. I never heard anything so sensible. Apart from anything else, I would have regarded becoming a special advisor as a demotion. Not something I would want to do at all. No, the truth was that I remained in Downing Street very much longer than anyone else who worked for her, except Dundee, her prospective, my great good friend. And so, if you stay that amount of time, of course you begin to know the Prime Minister's mind very well. The Prime Minister puts more confidence in you. You can often speak on her behalf, knowing what she would decide and so on. And people begin to resent that. There were even ridiculous articles in the press calling me the real Deputy Prime Minister, which would have been offensive to the real Deputy Prime Minister, who was an extremely good one. But I'm afraid jealousies build up, and people begin to talk about courtiers and people with too much influence, and they should be moved and so on. And indeed, the Foreign Office, and indeed in the end, my good friend Bobby Butler were very keen to move me, and I was constantly being offered an ascending choice of embassies to go and be ambassador, and they said, wouldn't you go be ambassador in Switzerland? And then they tried Sweden, and then they tried Spain, and the final offer was Germany. But by then I decided that I'd had enough anyway of life with foreign affairs. I wanted to do something else. So no, I in my eyes, I was absolutely not politically tainted. I kept out of politics, but I was very closely involved in advising Margaret Thatcher over a very long time. And I understand why people thought I was no longer as independent as a civil servant should be, and that actually it would have been quite hard for the civil service to take me back in, even though they were ready to do so. And so it was also the decent thing to do, to leave the civil service and seek another life.
But do you, in general, do you agree with the role of special advisors, or do you think that they're very much political, and they should be appointed by a separate committee and not the Prime Minister.
Well, I personally take the view that special advisors are totally unnecessary. They're just a way for ambitious young men who want to get into politics and make a rapid career to get in at an early stage and get themselves attached to a minister, and then hope they can, after 4 or 5 years, get selected to fight a parliamentary seat and get into parliament in their late 20s, and then quite quickly become a junior minister and so on. So it's part of a career progression for ambitious young politicians. I don't think I don't think that ministers get from them anything they can't get from good civil servants, plus whatever political advice they can get directly from Conservative central office. So I think I personally regret the emergence of special advisors, but I acknowledge that they're there. They're not going to disappear simply because I don't think they're necessary. But I think it was a pity in our constitutional system that they came, at least in such great numbers. Maybe if every minister wants one person who can help him in his constituency and do some political tasks and liaising with central office and backbench members of his party, yes, that's all right. But the phalanxes of special advisors who are now emerging, I think, is far in excess of anything that's necessary, and is a great pity. And I say that even though my brother, as you know, became a special advisor and of a very senior sort as Tony Blair's chief of staff. I always thought it was a pity he left the civil service and didn't stay as a civil servant.
Just a short question on Europe. Do you think that people are becoming more anti-European?
No, I don't think they are instinctively, no. I think they are being persuaded that a lot of aspects of Europe are unnecessary or interfere too much with our life in this country. And there's an enormous barrage of propaganda from certain parts of the media, from certain parts of the Conservative Party, telling them how awful Europe is. But I still think, actually, that people are basically comfortable with being members of the European Union and the advantages it brings, the free passage across borders, the ability to work elsewhere, the single market and all that. And they regard the common agricultural policy as pretty balmy at a price worth paying to be part of this broader association. What they don't want to see, I think, is it being taken too far in terms of too much compulsion to become integrated, to give up our national independence, our ability to take our own decisions. They don't like the euro for that reason. It takes away control of our currency and it restricts our sovereignty. People want Britain to remain sovereign. So I think what they want is a more flexible membership of Europe that makes it possible for countries which want to advance more rapidly, as they have done with the euro. We've got whatever it is, 24 countries as members of the euro. And that's fine. If they want to do that, we'll stand aside from that bit of it. We've stood aside from the Schengen Union, so we still have controls on our borders. We were worried about the number of immigrants who would get through, and I must say our fears have been justified. We stood aside from the justice and security part of the Lisbon Treaty, so we're not full members of that. And we've stood aside in our time, my time, Margaret Thatcher's time more importantly, from the social chapters of Europe, though Tony Blair took Britain back into those. So it is possible to have this partial membership or this flexible membership, and I think people are happy with that, because fundamentally they want to be in Europe. And I believe a referendum on whether we should stay in Europe can be won, provided people are prepared to stand up and fight for it and make a case, and provided also that other European countries are sensible enough to recognise there needs to be some flexibility in the system to let Britain go on being a part of Europe without having to sign up to every excessive demand for centralisation and for running our affairs from Brussels.
But will the United Kingdom have a future without Europe?
Yes, of course it will. Every country will survive, and you don't have to belong to a club to survive outside it. I'm not a member of the Whites or the Carlton Club, and I've seemed to got through my life perfectly well without that. That's a slight exaggeration. But you don't have to belong. But I think our economic growth would be hampered rather than advanced outside the European Union. I think people would lose out from the sense of community with European peoples, not so much with governments. And always remember, the intellectual structure of Europe is an elite project. It's something conceived by elites, it's been pushed forward by elites with minimum consultation with people. The very rare occasions there have been referendums in Europe, even in countries like France, Netherlands, Ireland, Denmark, people have actually voted against Europe when they've got the chance, and they've been told to think again, and made to vote again until they came up with the right answer. And that's not a very democratic way of proceeding. So, as I say, I believe Britain should remain part of Europe, could remain part of Europe, and we would be better off in the right sort of Europe than we would be outside the wrong sort of Europe.
And my last question would be, what would you advise? What would be your advice to a modern Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think the present day Prime Minister or any of his successors are looking for my advice. I would simply say, stay true to your values and beliefs. Don't be too tactical. Don't be blown off course by bad newspaper coverage or minor political crises. Set out what you stand for, what you believe in, and stick to it. And at the end of the day, if you can convince people in the way that Margaret Thatcher could convince people that however tough life was going to be for a few years, she was the person who would get them the right answers and the right policies. Take that attitude and you'll succeed.
Thank you very much, Lord Powell, for giving
Great
me your
pleasure to
time.
talk to you.
Thank you very
Very
much.
much.
Thank you.